everybody, and welcome back to the Harder Not Smarter podcast. Today's guest is Norman Ohler, the author of the book Tripped, Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the Dawn of the Psychedelic Age. Got it right here. It is absolutely phenomenal. He's also written the New York Times bestseller Blitz, talking about drugs within the Third Reich. And he's written several novels as well. I won't even try uh, to
Pronounce
say the
them.
names. My
Yeah.
my German is not on point, so I'll spare you that. But Norman, welcome to the show. I'm super excited to talk with you about uh, LSD culture and the story of how it became. Like I had no idea what LSD really was and how simplistic the the production of it was. I thought it was some like crazy chemical thing, and your breakdown of the discovery, the propagation through World War II, the CIA getting its hands on it, and then obviously its propagation through particularly American society, but global society. So, Norman, welcome to the show.
Happy to be talking to you
So
and all the listeners.
the I guess the research started with the original book Blitzed. We'll jump there first. So you're talking about drug use within the Third Reich, within Nazi Germany. You hear stories about Hitler using methamphetamines, his soldiers using amphetamines and other drugs to improve performance. You're obviously German yourself. You live in Berlin. Tell us a little bit about how you decided to get into this track and do the research into these books.
Well, I've always been interested in drugs since my early 20s when I was living in New York and had my first involuntary dose of LSD at night in downtown Manhattan. Since that day, I'm quite interested in drugs because the experience was actually mind-blowing. And since I worked with my mind being a writer, I found it interesting what's happening in my brain and that I perceive differently than I did before. So I kind of got into drugs, and then at one point I realized there's a lot of different types of drugs. Um, you could say there's good drugs and bad drugs, or you could say there's healthy drugs and unhealthy drugs, or there's drugs that make you addicted and drugs that don't make you addicted. For example, LSD does not make you addicted, and in fact, the founder of AA was first had used LSD to get off alcohol and had at first thought that LSD therapy should be included into the AA program, which then didn't happen because LSD became illegal. So drugs is like a wide topic. It's an interesting topic because it's basically substances that act very strongly with our brain. So it would be good, I think, as humans to know how it works and what works and why some substances are good and why some are bad, since they're
Mm-hmm.
all basically, except alcohol, illegal. And in fact, that caused also the research to be illegal. We hardly don't know anything about these potent substances. Um, so that's interesting to discover and then go deeper into it. And I mean, I also write books that have nothing to do with drugs. I wrote an 18th century crime novel set in a swamp area east of Berlin that I guess they smoked an opium pipe once, but it wasn't about drugs. But you also have to understand that drugs have always been part of our story, of the human story. So uh, just because they're illegal doesn't mean that they are not relevant for our society, for the development of consciousness, also for development of bad of addiction, and they are two-sided sword. So. Um, that's how I became interested. I guess that initiation was that LSD trip in Manhattan, and then I did a lot of drugs personally for my leisure. Let's say after in the first 10 years of the millennium, between 2000 and 2010, I was younger than today, and I was living in Berlin, which has a big club culture, music culture, and it's often connected to some types of drugs. So I also consume them. Uh, and then later, when I started writing about drugs and National Socialism, I kind of realized that this kind of leisurely drug taking in Berlin clubs was in a way also preparation for writing this book, because the book lists on drugs during the so-called Third Reich can only be written by someone who actually understands the substances.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even I didn't quite understand what was in the records, but I have a friend who knows a lot about drugs. And for example, when he read that Hitler was consuming Eukodal, 20 milligrams intravenously, he freaked out because he had been using opioids, which I have never used actually. He had been using opioids, and he said this is such an intense dose that Hitler's consciousness certainly will be changed while he's on 20 milligrams of Eukodal, which today is marketed as oxycodone. But what is given in America usually as tablets, Hitler injected into his veins, got injected by his personal physician. So that creates a very strong change in the consciousness. So that becomes interesting for an historian like myself. And that's only possible actually because my friend, I knew someone who really knew about how drugs work. So uh, cutting a long story short, I think my personal use of drugs then led me to a more academic and thorough investigation of what they actually are for myself, for my family, but also for history. What happened during the Third Reich when drugs were used massively? This is kind of how it got started.
How is the culture in Germany versus the U.S. when it comes to drugs? Like I know in the U.S. there's a big movement currently to legalize, like MDMA, psilocybin, and other alternative therapies or psychedelics for therapeutic uses. What's it like over in Germany now, and how has it been in the past compared to the U.S.?
Well, I think Germany is a bit more backwards because the discourse in America is bigger, and I think partly because of the veterans being treated. I guess I'm not that familiar with what's actually going on, but I hear that psychedelic trauma therapy is being used for veterans. We don't have veterans so much right now in Germany, and if a topic is relevant to veterans, it becomes relevant to the country because these are the people that actually fought for the country. So I think that made the discourse in America larger and more sophisticated. I mean, in Germany, at least, we had the legalization of cannabis countrywide on April 1st. So we're the first large country, I
Oh wow.
believe, in the Western world that has legalized cannabis. But with psychedelics, the Germans should know about them, and a lot do, but it's more like the people who are actually using it are in the scene, which is quite a lot. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, but like the normal like the mainstream population doesn't really know that much about it. I mean, my father was quite surprised when I told him the story of LSD. He was a former high judge in Germany who actually put people in prison for drug offenses. So, and my mother, his wife, suffers from Alzheimer, and I read in a study, an American study actually, that low dosages of LSD help might help Alzheimer patients. But he's like, why? What is this? I don't, he got suspicious. He didn't really get it. So I basically wrote this book for him, kind of explained to him that LSD, which was, a product by a very respected Swiss pharmaceutical giant, which is Sandoz, who is now Novartis. They developed it. I mean, the product is, it's it was developed as a medicine. So most people don't know this. My father also didn't know this. I guess in America it's a bit more known than in Germany. It's actually funny that today I received a letter because after my research, we decided in the family to use LSD for my mother. And my father also microdoses now, and he never feels anything, but my mother always has a mood improvement and a cognitive improvement whenever she's on a low dosage of LSD. She doesn't have a trip, but her brain is activated in those areas where dementia and Alzheimer deactivate. Um, so my father happily gives it to her, and about 2 weeks ago, he received a visit from four members of the German criminal police, and they were investigating him for handling LSD, and he said that the officers were quite embarrassed as they entered his home because he's quite known in the small town as like the former very high judge, and they
Mm-hmm.
said, we're very sorry, but we must investigate this. What was this with this LSD? Like they also had no idea. They I mean, LSD is not harmful. It doesn't. He gave LSD in small dosages to his wife, who consented of taking these, and she always had an improvement in mood, like when it was given like once a week or twice a week. So it's not very dangerous what he does actually, and even the physician in the town had was like um, saying yes to the experiment because it is an experiment because LSD is
Mm-hmm.
illegal. So it was right in a way that the policeman came, but they kind of felt they could feel that it's an awkward situation. Why is it prohibited? Why don't we know anything about it? That's basically what I tried to write about in the book Tripped.
Was
So he
was
could
there
he could
was there presence here because of what you wrote about it in the books? I know at the very end of it, you talk about how all three of you took some together. You walked through the park. Is
yeah.
that why they visited you?
No, because that was too long ago, actually. But they did visit because my father appeared in a German national TV clip. Like a
Mm-hmm.
couple of million saw him. This was a clip about my book, and they traveled to my hometown and they interviewed him, and he very openly spoke about what he did in a very, for me, amazing manner, like how he processes it and how he describes the effects with my mother and that finally he has a medicine in his hand while before he had nothing because there's nothing against Alzheimer. So it's quite touching actually the interview, and I think they said because of that interview the prosecutor started his investigations. Maybe he thought he had to because so openly on German TV, like a man was
Mm-hmm.
saying, "I'm giving illegal drugs to my wife because it improves her health." He could also be crazy. He could maybe he's poisoning her. So the state, I guess, has to take a look at it. They should have just read my book, I guess. Maybe they just saw the TV interview and didn't read my book. Because if they would have read my book, they would have seen that it's even more ridiculous what they're doing. And then my father wrote an email to me that they also said that they would search my house in Berlin because I was also charged, because I also appear in that TV interview.
Mm-hmm.
But today I received a letter, and then I wrote an email back to them saying, listen, this is. I explained basically what it is, and today I received a letter that they stopped the prosecution. So
That's a huge
there's no
step
more
in terms
charges
of
being pressed against that. Yeah, my father's a bit
in terms.
sad because he was kind of looking for a scandal. Like he thought they should prosecute me for like he was ready for it because he likes to fight. He's a judge.
Yeah,
And he would have been good, in court. He would have enjoyed being in court, being on the other side for the first time.
that's incredible, and I'm sure it's probably going to be some kind of precedent moving forward in terms of making this more available. Maybe
Yeah,
maybe not legalize it, but decriminalize it. Kind of like what Colorado did with psilocybin mushrooms. They didn't legalize it, but they said we're no longer essentially going to prosecute. We're no longer going to arrest anybody for psilocybin
oh
use.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, okay,
and
that's
so
good. Yeah,
hearing stuff like this, yeah, hearing stuff like this, where
yeah,
the state comes down, they start an investigation, they talk to the people, and then they drop the charges. At that point, that it's almost a a grant of permission from the state for people to start using this a little bit.
yeah, yeah. So that's the trip story. Basically, that's the
And
trip story in a nutshell.
and it's funny how I came across, like I was flying from San Diego to Florida to visit my in-laws, and I'd forgotten a book at home, so I stopped at the airport bookstore, and this book was just sitting on the shelf. Obviously, the color scheme caught my attention, and then the name
Mm.
was so salacious. The Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the dawn of the psychedelic age. And I think at that point we had just interviewed Christy Myers, who offers ketamine assisted therapy for similar people, law enforcement and veterans with PTSD, anxiety, TBIs, and other issues. And so began researching this
Yeah.
topic more and more. And so I grabbed this book, not really knowing what to expect. I hadn't heard of your original book, and
Yeah.
I think I crushed through this entire thing in less than a week. 'Cause
Yeah.
the information in here was so outside of what I'd heard before, and then the stories that you tie in. And I don't want to ruin it for the listeners because it's absolutely worth reading. The stuff in here is incredible. But honestly, the most entertaining and most interesting stuff was when you started getting into the CIA's involvement with LSD. I forget the individual's name, but he was basically put in charge of the MK Ultra program.
Sidney
But the
Gottlieb.
yeah, but the rampant use of LSD within the CIA organization, and it was almost like childhood games or a fraternity. They were literally dosing each other in secret. Like they'd be walking by and drop LSD tabs in someone's coffee, or they'd be at a party and put it in someone's wine. It was a mixture of research, but also validation of the stuff to make sure that people aren't disclosing secrets, because that was the whole idea, was this is potentially a truth serum, and that's what the CIA was going after, and that's why they were so worried about it getting into the general population's hands, because if it got into the Russians' hands, then we're worried about the Russians using it against Americans as a truth serum. But hearing how they would literally dose each other at a party and just watch what would happen. People would go out and have bad trips. They'd be gone for 24 hours, wandering the streets. Um, and these guys were just documenting everything that was happening within the organization.
Must have been a great time to be a part of the CIA.
Or terrifying.
Or terrifying. Depends on how you look at it.
So when you were doing the research for this, where were you able to pull these anecdotal stories about what these guys were doing?
Well, I always try to go to archives instead of reading books by other authors and then taking stuff from there. But I also do that. But some historians only do that, so I find it mandatory actually to find original stuff in archives. But it's not so easy. In and the Novartis archive, the headquarters of Novartis is in Basel, Switzerland. That was a particularly hard nut to crack because they don't. Well, the problem with an archive is to find what you're looking for, because the amount of information that's in the archive is so vast that really it's like finding the needle in the haystack. So you depend on how well the archive is organized, basically, and how that is presented to you. That's a so-called find book, which is usually a computer database that you can access sometimes from home, sometimes only in the archive. And then in conversation with the archivist, you can narrow down where. I was looking actually for a meeting that happened between Sidney Gottlieb and the CEO of Sandoz. Arthur Stoll is his name. Um, in the early 50s, when the CIA operative flew to Basel to talk to Stoll that LSD should not be sold to the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. It should only be
Mm-hmm.
given to the West, and that the CIA would like to have a full record of people who receive larger amounts, because the CIA had the idea that it might be a truth serum, just like the Nazis. The Nazis basically were the first ones to have this idea, and then that's why the American military thought the same, because they discovered the papers by the SS about psychedelic research in concentration camp of Dachau, and then the CIA basically learned it from the American military. I mean, they did learn it from a Harvard professor called Henry K. Beecher, who was the drug expert for the American military, and he kind of looked at the SS reports that were done in Dachau and then wrote a report on ego-depressant drugs, which landed on the desk of Sidney Gottlieb, and LSD was like the key drug there. That's why Gottlieb flew to Basel to make sure that LSD is not being sold to the Soviet Union, to Moscow. This potential dangerous weapon. I mean, the joke is that actually in Czechoslovakia, which was a socialist country, a part of the Warsaw Pact, they had a large LSD research. They basically copied it. So they found the formula somehow and then had an own factory making LSD, and they had their own socialist LSD program, which is very, very unknown. Like, I don't think there's a book about it, actually. So that was exactly what Sidney Gottlieb tried to prevent, because he was really afraid if the Soviet Union uses LSD against America, they might get an edge in the Cold War, which is, it's a totally paranoid thought, but maybe as as a military, you always think, what if the other side, how can we defend ourselves? So if the Russians use LSD against us, we have to know about LSD. That's why the CIA made this extensive LSD program, abusing actually dozens of American universities by funding their LSD research, because LSD was the big thing in the early 50s. Like, scientists thought this is the key to the human mind. Now we can actually investigate what's going on in the black box of the brain through LSD. They thought with LSD, because it's so effective in such small quantities, and I don't know exactly. Like, they were curious about LSD. Like, they tried to understand the mind through LSD and the interaction between LSD and the mind. And CIA kind of tailored all of these experiments to their own. How can you actually manipulate a person? That was how can you manipulate? How can you weaken a person? How could you steal secrets from a person? How could you turn that person into the Manchurian Candidate? So that those were all like questions that were interesting to Sidney Gottlieb. That's why he flew to Basel, to make sure that LSD is being basically regulated by the CIA, or at least that the CIA always knows about LSD in the world. LSD, I mean, was quite unknown at the time. It was not like today. Like, this was like, but Sidney Gottlieb probably knew more about LSD than anyone else, except probably Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, who really knew a lot about LSD, the Swiss chemist. So I went to Sanders,
which
to
was an
Novartis
amazing
archive.
story in and of itself.
Yeah, that's also interesting. We can talk about that in a second. But let me just close this thread, or follow this train of thought. I wanted to find some kind of record about that meeting. I wanted to read, like, in the Novartis archive, like a statement by the CEO that he did after the meeting, writing like, I had I don't know, a diary entry, or like what actually was said. And I read in a different book by a journalist called Marx about that meeting, but I didn't find an original paper. Like, the archivist just didn't give it to me, or it doesn't exist. So it's kind. But we know a lot around it, but there's no record of this particular meeting. So that, for example, I wasn't able to find, but I was able to. And at that point, I was already deep in the archive, and I was able to understand that the destiny of LSD is actually not connected to this famous Albert Hofmann, the discoverer, who is famous because he discovered LSD. It's a very interesting story in itself. If we have time, we can talk about that later.
Of course.
But what's actually interesting are the decisions being made by the head of the company, the strategic decisions, and that's the decisions by Arthur Stoll, the CEO. So I looked at his papers, and I guess his papers are not studied often. I mean, who cares about a Swiss CEO from some pharmaceutical company in the years 1943 till 1949? No one looks at this stuff. But I looked at it because during that time, namely in 1943, LSD was discovered, and why wasn't Sandoz really able to put it on the market? That was actually the question that was driving me. That was the question of my father. If it's so promising, why can't I buy it in the pharmacy? So I found in these papers that the best friend of this guy was actually another biochemist, and his name was Richard Kuhn, and he was not Swiss, he was German. They had the same mentor when they were young and learning biochemistry, Stoll and this Richard Kuhn, the German guy and the Swiss, they had the same mentor. His name is Richard Willstätter, Jewish-German genius of biochemistry, who was rewarded with the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So he had these two promising students, Stoll on the one hand, the Swiss guy, and Kuhn on the other hand, the German guy. And Kuhn and Stoll had been writing like in the 20s and 30s, always sharing their scientific discoveries and strategies and different plants they look at, and what can be be done, and what medicines can be developed. And then also 43, when LSD was discovered at Sandoz, Stoll wrote about it, and this letter I found the communication between Stoll and Kuhn, because Kuhn was at the time 43 in Germany. He was the leading biochemist of the Nazi regime. He was responsible for developing biochemical weapons. Like, he was the head of the program. I mean, he had the most intelligence about biochemical weapons, and he hears from his best friend in Switzerland that the most potent uh, molecule for the mind has been found, and we at Sandoz, we call it lysergic acid diethylamide. It was a totally weird, thing that they discovered. So of course it became very interesting for Kuhn, who at the time had to search to research a so-called truth drug, because Hitler wanted a truth drug, because there were so many attempts on his life that he wanted to have like a thing that he gives to an opponent, and the opponent has to take it or put it in a coffee or something, like the CIA did later. Uh, and then you can basically read a person, which is not what LSD does, but they didn't know it at the time. So this is how the Nazis became interested in Kuhn. Sorry, Kuhn, the Nazi, became interested in LSD. That's how he heard about it from Stoll, from the source itself. So he received actually the precursor to LSD, and that document, like stating and thanking Stoll that he received the stuff from Basel, that I found in the archive. And that's actually what makes, for me, a book. If you find something that hasn't been found before. I mean, in a nonfiction book. In a fictional book, you find anything, anyhow, everything's new, because you're just writing a new story. But in a nonfiction book, it's nice to not rehash other stuff, but to actually find something else, something new.
Yeah, hearing about the connection with all these high level organizations about a drug. For me growing up, you hear about these drugs and you just think it's stuff similar to weed and mushrooms and other things like that. Like, I just assumed it was another thing of that category. But hearing how it was developed by one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in the world at the time, and then how it got tied in with Nazi Germany and the CIA, and how governments were literally stepping in, having conversations with the leadership of this organization, trying to keep it hushed, suppressing the distribution, going after individuals who are trying to distribute it, which is even crazier at the time, because you think of the 1950s as these very conservative, clean cut, um, put together people, and then you're giving them this incredible drug that nothing at the time had ever been experienced like that, and it's just completely altering these individuals. People from Harvard and MIT and heads of government are trying this stuff, and it's revolutionizing how people think about things. And so it really
Yeah.
puts a twist onto the story of how this stuff came about. It's Nobel Prize winning chemists and people like that are involved, not random hippie bohemians that are just finding mushrooms in the woods. Like, this was a very concerted
Yeah.
effort to create and develop this.
I mean, also LSD is not really a hippie drug, It can be used by hippies or by anybody basically, but it doesn't have a political agenda actually. It has certain effects on the mind, which are very interesting effects, because LSD decreases the energy level of the ego, what the default mode network it's also called, and therefore other parts of the brain have a better chance of communicating also with each other. So there's different, like, new connections are being made in the brain. Basically, that's what it is. It's the brain is a, it's called neuroplastic organ. So it's constantly, you know, connecting and changing, and it's always adapting to the current situation, how to best solve the solution if it's a healthy brain. Um, so under LSD, the neuroplasticity is enhanced. So there's more connectivity in the brain. So I guess if you would say that hippies enjoy that more than, like, maybe conservative people, I don't know. Maybe that's true. Conservative basically means you want to stay. I mean, maybe it doesn't. Conservative means you want to conserve something, I guess. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, LSD does have this revolutionary spark in it, because it always it I would say it creates new. It always creates new connections. So, but I also heard that, I mean, there has been a study actually that psilocybin decreases fascist behavior, whatever that is. I guess it's rigid orthodox thought forms that just keep, looping, which could be, the left could also have these thought forms. So that's kind of disrupted by LSD or psilocybin. So it's not really a hippie drug. It's actually a drug for us. I find it quite scandalous that we don't know more about it, because I think actually that LSD is quite healthy. I think it's a brain food. Obviously, it also has dangers. If you take a very high dosage and you're mentally unstable, that's not good. You shouldn't do that when you're mentally unstable. So it's like, not everyone should drive a car, or I don't know. I mean, I don't think I think the health benefits by far outweigh the dangers. Um, so I would like just to know, more about it. I mean, I know quite a lot about it, but we as a community still don't know enough about it. Like, can we really develop a medicine against dementia out of LSD or another psychedelic compound? And it looks like we probably could, but do we really want this? At the moment, we don't want it. And I don't actually understand why, because dementia, well, I guess you would have to look at who makes money from dementia. Is that really, like, could that be a problem? And that could people that make money from dementia not want LSD to be developed into a medicine? I don't know about that. Still, we should know much more. And I wish that, well, we can all hope that we in our generation, that we can still, maybe have a medicine against dementia. I think it is LSD, but I don't know, because the science just has been stopped since Nixon declared it illegal in the mid 60s, because for him, LSD was like a leftist drug, because all the hippies are taking it, and then all the hippies are against the Vietnam War. I mean, maybe there were different reasons actually to be against the Vietnam War. I mean, maybe it was, badly, whatever, it was, LSD is not the problem of the Vietnam War, but it made a lot of people realize that the Vietnam War should be stopped. And Nixon didn't want this, so later his advisor said we could not really make demonstrations illegal, but we could actually criminalize people who take part in demonstrations and take something like LSD. If we make LSD illegal, we can, arrest them. Basically, we can crack down on the scene. So that's why LSD, which Nixon thought was like turning everyone into a hippie, became illegal in the mid '60s. But the phenomenon is much more complex.
It's
I think we
crazy
figured
hearing.
out how to how to solve the problem in America. It was, we need to get the far right and the far left all into a room, and we need to give them psilocybin, and hopefully that will decrease their fascist behavior, and we can live all peacefully together in the U.S. here. I think that's the solution. I think, Norman, you just hit it on the
Well,
head.
I think actually in general, legalization of psychedelics is a big step for a democratic society, because a democratic society is based on individual freedom, and part of individual freedom is, the right to determine how I stimulate my brain. If there's like a plant that I think is beneficial for me, I mean, if I'm crazy and I'm eating like a poison, maybe I should be stopped. But I mean, just for example, cannabis has been illegal in Germany for decades, and maybe it makes you a bit sleepy. I don't know. It doesn't make me sleepy, but maybe some people become a bit lethargic. But it also has so many medicinal benefits and health benefits, and is a mood enhancer. And for a lot of people, it's just nicer to live with marijuana than without it. Just like for some people, it's nicer to live with the alcohol than without it. Um, I don't know where I'm going with this thought. I'm sorry. I think we're talking about the
It's
legalization of. No. Now I remember. I didn't take anything, so my brain is a bit slow. Uh, I
we didn't
think
have
in
you
a
light one
West,
up for the show.
I think in a democratic society, I think to legalize psychedelics would be a big step to strengthen that democratic society, because it opens a discourse. Um, it's moving a step towards truth, or some kind of living not based by an ideology. We have a very strong anti-drug ideology which came out of the Cold War, which had its reasons, but we're in a different age now. It's just not timely anymore to prohibit psychedelics. We should immediately legalize them. I, for example, think Germany should have legalized psychedelics and not cannabis. I think cannabis is actually a harder drug because you can get psychologically addicted to cannabis. There's potheads who need to smoke pot all the time. That's not good. Not all, most cannabis users are not like this, but it is a danger that it becomes addictive. While psychedelics, you never become addicted to psychedelics. I mean, I tried to become addicted to LSD in the mid '90s. I just took it a lot, but it's not addictive. You just realize you take it for the 10th time, and then why would you take it an 11th time? Because you understand what you needed to understand, because you do understand much more when you're on it. So the only danger is that you might understand too much, and then it's like too much information. So that's the word of cautioning it, because I do make I do talk a lot about the benefits of something like LSD. So I always want to also remind our listeners of the danger. So you should get informed before you do something like that, and maybe do it with a friend, or do it with a family member, or with a therapist. You don't need a therapist. You just need, if you do it for the first time, you need someone who's experienced with it and who can help you a little bit with it. And I think it's a very interesting thing to include in your life, actually.
Tell us about your first experience unit. You said you did it in New York. I mean, that's a very stimulated environment anyway.
Yeah, that's,
How
for
was it?
example, a mistake. That's a mistake. The most important things with taking psychedelics is set and setting. Set is your personal mindset at the moment. Like, do I feel stable, or am I like paranoid and on the rock? And like, then you shouldn't. You shouldn't take LSD. But if you're stable, if you're not afraid of finding out something, but because you might find out something from your childhood, or let's say you're a veteran, you fought, you might remember things, that you have suppressed now because they were terrifying. So the question you would have to ask yourself is, do I actually want to see this so I can, get through it? Or is it too much and I don't want to? Because if you have that reaction, don't do it, or wait until you're ready. So that's the set. And the setting is, you should do it in nature, you should do it, or maybe in a nice room with one friend. You shouldn't do it at a party. You shouldn't do it in downtown Manhattan Saturday night at 10 p.m. on the street. You
That
shouldn't
sounds oddly
you
specific.
shouldn't do it in the German railway system, which is always late, and you sit there with like people you don't like for like 5 hours. That's not a place to take LSD. You should do it, on the beach, or you'll figure it out. So my first trip had, the set was good because I was curious. I was young. I was a writer. I wanted to write my first books. I was interested in experiences, so the set was good. I got it from my girlfriend at the time, so I trusted her that she wouldn't. She said, "Let's take LSD." I had no idea what it was. So we just took it. the setting was also in a way good because it was downtown Manhattan, but it's a hardcore setting, because at the time there were a lot of freaks on the street, and it was a bit rougher than it is today. Today it's boring and gentrified, thanks to the American's mayor Giuliani. He basically ruined New York City for artists because it was really a great place before, and then when it became gentrified, it became too expensive. So now only boring people live there. To give a cliche description of much more complicated processes, but basically that's it. Yeah. So at the time, it was very interesting, walking there in 1993 through the East Village to the Lower East Side. I mean, that was interesting in itself. You don't need LSD. It was like you met, people with, it was a lot going on the street. So with LSD, that was, and the I don't know actually what Anna gave me at the time. It was so strong. I've taken quite a lot of LSD afterwards, and I never matched that strength. That one trip, that first trip was much stronger. And I've asked, neuroscientists if there's any, evidence that the first trip is always stronger, and because there's not a lot of research actually. I mean, there is, that I guess you could research that, but it's some say I don't know. And actually, one scientist said there is evidence that the first trip is stronger because the brain is not used to it, so the brain's like more surprised. It's like actually it's like a dance with the. You could describe it as like a dance in the brain actually. That the compound docks into in German it's synaptic gaps, like in
Yep.
the English is missing me, but you can easily research what actually happens in the brain. There is a little like it docks onto, and then it kind of starts shaking, and so it's an excited state of mind, and this excited state of mind is stronger when you take it for the first time. Maybe not, but maybe you should be careful when you take a large dose. And this was, I guess, a very large dosage. And it took quite a while. It took like 45 minutes. I felt nothing. I said to Anna, this is nothing. Nothing's happening. It's boring. And I was in the toilet of a falafel place on Avenue A. And then when the walls started kind of like almost like breathing, but quite strong. Like I could really see the walls moving, which I guess is a hallucination, because they're obviously not moving, but you can see or sense that actually the walls are not rigid, but that they're made, it's all vibration basically. So the old hippie saying, or, it's true, everything's vibration, nothing's rigid. So you can actually see that. I could see that. And then I went into my favorite bar just to calm down a bit because, it got quite strong, seeing the walls, vibrate. That was unusual. I went into my favorite bar, the No-Tell Motel, and I met my friend Dora Espinosa I think she's from Peru, and she's quite short, being from Peru. She's like 150. I don't know how much that is in feet, but it is quite short. But when I saw her, she was like this short, like as like she was as tiny as my thumb, and she was standing like between my toes, basically. It was like an Alice in Wonderland effect. And I looked down at her and I said, Dora, do I look bigger than usual? And she said, no, you're very tall, you're German, but you look the same. I said, well, you don't look the same, but that's not your fault. And then I went outside, and then it was a really strong trip with a lot of hallucinations. It was quite fascinating, but it was also scary because I didn't really know before that this would happen. Then at one point I thought this is what people always mean when they say drugs. Like this is really something very strong. But obviously a lot of drugs act very differently. Like there's a very specific LSD, effect, these hallucinations. It's quite fun actually. It can be scary because you're not, I also saw scary things. Like we saw like people beating up each other. Anna and me, we both saw it, but it wasn't true because we saw like a full-blown race riot on Second Avenue in Manhattan. Like cabs were being stopped, windows were being smashed. Like it was a large, epic movie in front of our eyes. And the next day there was nothing in the news. Like we had completely hallucinated that. And that has never happened to me again afterwards. It's a very strong effect. I don't know why, this was really, so this was very interesting. So that was my first LSD trip. I was quite terrified while it happened because I thought I would go crazy. I didn't understand that the LSD trip ends after a few hours. I thought now my brain is somehow forever changed. So it is a very potent substance. That's why in German the title is called the most potent substance or the most potent stuff.
Yeah,
So that was my
it's
first trip.
remarkable how little of this compound you need to take to feel its effects. Which brings me to the story that you mentioned earlier about the discovery of LSD. That remind me the guy's name who
Albert
discovered it
Hoffmann.
again. Yeah, Albert
Albert
Hoffman.
Hoffmann.
His initial experience. So you at least had some background knowledge. You understood that something was going to happen. You'd heard anecdotal stories about what the effects of this drug could be. I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like for Albert Hoffman as he's literally in his lab taking ingesting some of this stuff. No one has ever had any experience like this, at least as far as he was concerned. And then having these effects, and then I think you said he got on his bicycle and rode through the town to get home. It was like a 15-20 minute bike ride home, um,
Yeah.
which I can only imagine what that experience would have been like, having cars and trolleys and people going by while you're trying to balance on a bicycle, having these vivid hallucinations. For all I know, the buildings were doing something similar to what yours were, where the buildings were vibrating or breathing. And he called his assistant, and no one knows what's really going on. He doesn't know. They have no reference for what he's experiencing. Um, it must have just been a profound thing. And didn't the people in the lab start testing it on themselves at that point too?
Well, I mean, what happened then at Sanders was they were looking for a stimulant. So LSD is in a way a stimulant, but it's a stimulant on the mind and not on the peripheral nervous system. Like they were looking more for something like methamphetamine, because
Mm-hmm.
in Germany at the time, a company had become quite rich with methamphetamine, which was not illegal at the time. So they were, a bit overwhelmed with LSD. Also, when Hoffman had taken it for the first time and he had this very strong effect, his doctor came and measured his pulse and his heart and checked him out, and he said, "You have nothing. You're totally normal. Like LSD doesn't change your physical functions; it just works on the brain. I mean, you have more energy because the brain is stimulated, but it's not like you're sweating or your heart races or nothing like what happens to you when you take cocaine or methamphetamine, which gives you that physical boost, which then, when you come down, uh, leads to fatigue and depression, and then you have to take it again. So that's how the physical addiction, starts. LSD doesn't have that payback, or like it
Mm-hmm.
just it's it gives you more while it happens, but it doesn't take anything physically out of you. It doesn't drain you. I mean, you might be a bit tired after an LSD trip because so much information, processed through your brain more than usual, much more than usual. So that's tiring, obviously. So you need maybe to drink a good juice or eat well in the evening, after the trip or something, and then rest. But you're not gonna have a hangover, which I think is quite something, because the intoxication is very, very strong, but you don't have a hangover at all. If you would try to reach the level of intoxication with alcohol, you would the next day would be horrible. And obviously also with cocaine and methamphetamine, which are very, unhealthy substances. Um, So what I was so Albert Hoffman, like, they didn't, he was like, the next day, like, he felt totally normal. He actually felt good. He's like, what happened to me like yesterday? What is this LSD? So they created a so-called a Rauschraum in German, an intoxication room at the company, and anyone employed there could, voluntarily go to the intoxication room. And there was like a secretary; she was typing away. Then people received, dosages of LSD, like, just put a drop in a glass of water. You don't even taste it, and then they described what they were feeling, like they were sitting in a chair and just, ex- experiencing the LSD, and the effects were so positive because they had no, negative thoughts about the LSD. Like, they didn't think of, will I jump out of the window? No, they just had better thoughts. They felt better. Like, they were saying things like, this is how I always wanted to feel. Or they were looking outside, they saw the clouds, and they're like realizing how, beautiful the structure actually is. So everyone had a good experience. So Sandoz actually thought this could be like a game-changing drug for the mind, because at the time there were no antidepressants and antipsychotics and as that we have now. So, but people still had, mental problems. I mean, there was a world war going on, which created a lot of mental problems. So Sandoz thought they have a very, lucrative medicine potentially in their hands. So then they treated, or they made the first test in a psychiatric hospital in Zurich, and they gave LSD to depressed patients. They only did like a few. I read these reports. They were like, it's not hundreds of people. It's like a dozen, maybe a dozen um, patients received LSD. Mostly like suicidal patients and severely depressed patients, and they also had a good reaction. Like, I read, it's in trip. Like, some could be released after the second dose because, it works against depression. I mean, now we have the academic, like, with the scientific proof, but they didn't have the proof yet. They just thought that, this LSD could be great actually. So, and then it happened that the CIA didn't really like Sandoz to develop it because they still thought LSD also has this other side, which is the truth drug side, which it actually doesn't have. So misconceptions by first the Nazis, then the American military, then the CIA kind of pushed LSD into, a, a corner where it shouldn't really have been pushed into.
Norman, I want to really thank you for being on the show. We did have a couple quick questions we wanted to ask before closing out.
Sure.
Greg, I think you had something regarding any fallout.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering if you've had any fallout from writing these books. Like, has anybody like, has there been any negative backlash from writing this book from any government agencies or anything like that? I mean, I know it's like historical information, so it's nothing really like damning for any like current administrations or anything like that. But I was wondering, what has been the general perception from some of these like three-letter agencies that you write about, CIA specifically?
There's been no reaction except that my father was visited by criminal police in his home. Um, I think people are generally more, thankful for getting information that they somehow believe in or at least find interesting. So the reactions so far have been good, and also, drugs are not so much more they're not really demonized anymore. We have different problems these days, like the drug. Like, it's okay to talk about drugs. Actually, people get interested in it and realize that the anti-drug policies are stupid and the prohibitionist laws are stupid. We still have them, but they're like dinosaurs. They will die out if it takes another 5 years. Maybe the next U.S. administration will legalize it, or maybe it will take another 50 years. But basically, this, it's not a taboo anymore. So I've only received positive response.
And after the success of Blitz and this book, what do you have on the horizon for you? Do you have any new nonfiction projects coming along? Do you have any novels you're writing?
Well, I'm actually traveling to California soon to do some research, but it's kind of top secret, so I don't want to. I mean, it's top secret
Ooh.
for me, so I don't really want to talk about it yet, but I will continue writing actually, because I
Awesome.
don't know else. I don't know what to do else. What else to do?
Well, I mean, you're
Research.
extremely gifted at it. As I said, I ripped through this book incredibly fast. It was just constantly pulling me in with new information and humor and details that I'd never heard before. So you're extremely gifted and talented in your craft, and especially on the research side, you take
Thank you.
a very different approach to make sure that you're thorough and you're not just writing things that people want to hear or repeating information that's already out there. So um, please keep
Thank
writing. I'm excited to hear what this next top secret project is, um, and your contribution to the show has been extremely profound. Like we really enjoyed talking with you, hearing the details of the LSD movement, the creation of it, and its stories. It went through all these organizational uh,
Great.
obstacles that brought us where we are today.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Norman.
Well, take care. Enjoy the afternoon with your son, and we look forward to hearing about this new project.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.